Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am your moderator, Amanda McLean, here, the farm management specialist here at North Dakota Farmers Union. As I said, thank you. This is part of our monthly webinar series, as the intent of these webinars are to provide you with the latest up-to-date information and have an in-depth conversation with our guest speakers. These webinars are held the third Thursday of every month at 10 a.m. Central Time. Today's topic, we will be covering ag market updates and outlooks with Dr. Frayne Olson. June's webinar will be a North Dakota legislative update with the North Dakota legislative team. A few housekeeping tips before we get started. Everyone is on a mute, but if you at any time have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat or the Q&A, and we will have time at the end of this presentation to actually discuss things with Frayne. Also, this webinar is being recorded, but if you'd like to rewatch it or share it with others, you can simply find it by going to YouTube and searching North Dakota Farmers Union. That's where you'll also find our other previous webinars. And at the end, we ask that you please take the exit survey. It really helps us with improving the content and delivering these webinars with that. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Frayne Olson. Frayne Olson, if you don't know, is the crop marketing and crop economics specialist at North Dakota State University. He is also the director of the Quanten Burdick Center for Cooperatives and Professors of Agribusiness and Applied Economics Department at NDSU. Dr. Olson conducts educational programs that focus on crop marketing outlook and price analysis, evaluating alternative crop marketing strategies, and the economics of crop contracting. As director of the Center for Cooperatives, he teaches a senior level course on cooperative business management and coordinates the center's research and outreach activities. He has a PhD from the University of Missouri in agricultural economics and a master's and a bachelor's in science in agricultural economics from North Dakota State University. With that, thank you, Frayne, and I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Amanda. All right, let me get, we've got a lot to go over in a short period of time. So let's just dive right in. I'm going to share my screen and make sure that everything is working correctly. Can you see that okay, Amanda?
Yep, looks good.
All right, fantastic. I just got to move a few things around on my screen to make sure this works. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Today, I'm going to be covering a combination of not only the crop market outlook, give you an update on some of the things that are going on within the world of pricing, but we're also going to talk about trade. And obviously, that's also something that is dominating conversations and discussions and a lot of questions. So just to give you some historical reference, we've got we're in the middle of planting season right now. And we did get an update on some USDA forecasts for what we call the new crop, the crop that's being planted now today. So that came out on Monday. So we've had a chance to review some of those numbers, and I'll try and go through those with you quickly and give you an idea of where we're at. But I wanted to give you some historical perspective here. So this is planted acreage in the United States. These are the major crops that we produce. The gold line on top is for corn. The green line is soybeans. The brown line is wheat. Now it's all wheat classes blended together. So it'd be spring wheat, winter wheat, durum, everything blended. The little dots on the far right-hand side is the information we got from the March prospective plantings report. So big survey of farm managers asking them, what are you intending to plant? That was in March. We'll get an update to that in June and ask farmers, well, what did you actually plant? Now there's usually a little bit of a difference. And sometimes that can be important, sometimes some years not so much. But I wanted to give you some perspective. Yes, we're expecting to see an increase in corn plantings with a decrease in soybean plantings. And wheat is probably a small decrease in all wheat. That'd be both, again, winter wheat as well as spring wheat. The reason I want to talk about this is specifically that, yes, even though we're seeing an increase in corn and a reduction in soybeans, these are well within kind of our normal variation or the normal bouncing around in acreage we have from year to year. So even though there's an increase and a decrease, it doesn't mean that we're going to see big dramatic shifts or changes in acreage this year. Now, let's shift to bushels. So instead of looking at acres, now let's look at bushels produced. So the gold line on the top is corn bushels, the green is soybean bushels, and the brown is wheat bushels. And again, the little dots on the far right-hand side are the current forecast. So based on the information we got on Monday, this is an updated slide. Okay, so we are expecting to see total corn production go up. Now what USDA is going to do, I'm going to show you in just a minute, is they're going to use trend line yield. So with an increase in acreage and putting in trend line yield, which is every year our average yield goes up a little bit because of trend line, we're looking at a record corn production. Of course, these are not confirmed numbers. There's a lot of growing season left. Yield numbers can change dramatically. However, these numbers give us kind of that benchmark, that reference point that the market's using, saying, well, if we come up with an average yield and we're looking at these extra acres, how many bushels do we think we're going to have? And that becomes our common reference point within the marketplace, not only for domestic buyers, but also for international buyers. Moving on to soybeans, a small decrease in total bushels produced, but very, very similar to last year. So even though we had more acres, we're looking at a slight reduction in yields because of the trend line. For wheat, very, very similar production levels on wheat this year versus last year. Now, when people talk about that corn is king, when you hear that in the marketplace, this is also what they're really talking about. It's just the large volume of corn that we produce and merchandise every year. And it definitely kind of overwhelms the volume that we have in soybeans and wheat. So given that context, we see a relationship between inventories, how much grain we have within the system, and pricing and price dynamics. So I want to go through this very quickly. This is the supply and demand table for corn. So in the far right-hand side, in red, is the information we got on Monday. So this is the first formal time that USDA is forecasting what we call new crop, the crop that's being seeded today. So all of these numbers are forecasts or predictions. The top number in planted area is based off of survey data. So this is information that farmers have told USDA through surveys. This is their intentions for planting. Now notice we are seeing an increase in planted area, okay, which is actually very similar to what we saw a couple years ago. So the red is the plantings right now, the blue is from last year, and then the green is from 2 years ago. Okay, so we're using that as kind of our short-term reference point. So if we compare what we planted a couple years ago versus the intentions this year, we're pretty close. It's actually very close, okay? Now the yield number is, again, a trend line yield. So that's an average yield that's been adjusted for better farming practices. So this would be an average yield given typical weather conditions, assuming that we have, again, increased technology, okay? So our total bushels produced are expected to be increased definitely from last year, but even from the year before. Now, if this holds, that would be a record corn production. Okay. Now we have some grain. We expect to have some corn left over from old crop, the stuff that's in the bin right now, that we carry forward. So we add up the amount of corn carry forward plus the expected production, and we look at total supply. And again, that's a very, very large number. And because there's this expectation for very large numbers for the supply side, that's one of the things that's putting downward pressure on prices right now. Now, the other half of that is, of course, the demand side. So with lower prices, what happens? We tend to get more consumption. So these are all mathematical forecasting. So it's based off a history, kind of historical relationships, given prices that we see in the United States as well as internationally. What do we think is going to happen based on historical relationships for feed consumption? Now, this would be whole corn that goes into the feed pile. So it's been corn that's run through a combine. It doesn't include corn silage or DDGs. We're looking at the ethanol industry as well as exports. Now, a lot of people were looking at, in the marketplace, we're looking at this forecast for export numbers. Okay, and the reason they were interested in that is because USDA, when they're doing their forecasting, especially for exports, They assume that the current trade policies that are in place at the time they run their models, at the time they run their forecasts, they assume that if they continue, this is what we would expect to see. So again, this is all forecasting based off of historical relationships. But this was a little bit of a surprise to people. I think there were some that were expecting, given all the trade tensions and the uncertainty going on in the global markets right now, that we may actually see a decrease in the amount of corn for export. But based on USDA's numbers, that didn't happen. And I think there's a reason for that, which I'll explain here in a few minutes. Okay, so if we look at these very large production numbers and some very strong consumption numbers, we are looking or expecting to see our ending stocks, the amount of grain in inventory, the amount of reserves that we have, if you will, to start to increase. So we had similar numbers about 2 years ago. We took them down, and this was a surprise. We got a little bit of a bump in the corn market from these numbers because USDA did increase the exports number for old crop, the stuff that's in the bin right now. So that marketing year hasn't been completed yet because we've had some pretty aggressive corn export sales, and I'll show those numbers in just a few minutes as well. So USDA did decrease the forecast for ending stocks of old crops. We're not going to have quite as much corn in the bin coming into harvest this year as we first expected, but it's still pretty substantial. And then given, again, if we have really good yields and we plant all the acres, the expectation is, or the best guess right now, the best forecast is that we're going to see an increase in ending stocks. Okay, so let's look at this graphically. Let's look at historically, what does this mean? I want to focus on the blue bars. This is the stocks to use ratio. So what we're doing is we're taking this ending stocks number and we're dividing by total use. So you're saying, what percentage of our total needs are we going to have in reserve in case there's a problem? Okay, and that's these red bars. And so it's scaled on a percentage on the right-hand side. The red line is total corn consumption. The green line is total corn production historically. So you can see historically what's happened with, again, both the production and consumption numbers. But I want to focus really on these blue bars because these blue bars have a really important impact on markets and market psychology, kind of what people's expectations are and how they view changes in information. So when we get new information into the marketplace, what happens? Do we get big responses or do we get small responses? So typically, when the inventories are very big, when our reserves are expected to be very large, and we get a new piece of news, let's say it's a new piece of news that we have these huge export sales. Well, that's great. Prices will go up. We expect that to happen because we've seen more corn consumed. But the question is, how much will it go up? Will it go up just a little bit, or is it going to be a big shock to the marketplace and prices go up very quickly? So there's this tendency that when the inventories are really big, when we have these big reserves, new pieces of information don't have a lot of shock value. We see prices going up and down. We see the volatility in prices, but it tends to be a bit muted. It isn't really big because we have these big supplies left over. In contrast, in the flip side is when our inventories are really small, we have the exact opposite. Because we have these really tight inventories, people get very, very nervous about new information. If we suddenly get a surge in exports or a big increase in domestic consumption, or we have a big decrease in production, the price response tends to be really, really big because our reserves aren't that tight. I mean, they're very tight. We don't have a big buffer. So the point I'm trying to make is not only do we see changes in like average prices, when inventories are really big, we tend to have average lower prices. We also tend to see more stable prices when we have big inventories. In contrast, when you have these tight inventories, we see the opposite, typically high prices with a lot more volatility. New news causes a lot of bouncing around in prices. So my point, this is where we're at today. So this hashed bar is the current forecast for ending stocks for old crop, the stuff that's in the bin right now, the reserves we have from last year. And they're a little bit tighter than what we've seen for the last couple of years. So for old crop, if we have new news, we tend to get a little bit more price response. versus our expectation for new crop. This would be the crop that's being planted now today. We're getting back to those levels where we're in the comfort zone. The market isn't really dramatically concerned about tight supplies. Okay, so the fact that we're looking at bigger acreages and right now average yields, which is going to be pretty robust, the corn market isn't terribly concerned about running out of corn. So let's look back historically. This goes back to about 2000. This is a graph that I pulled up for futures markets for corn going back actually to 1990. But I just want to focus on what's happened recently in the 2000s here. So when we have really tight inventories, oops, excuse me, wrong direction. We have really tight inventories like we saw back here in 10, 11, and 12. We tend to get very high prices. In contrast, when we have these big inventories, we tend to have very low prices with more stability. Okay, and then coming back to these tighter supplies, what happens? We have higher levels of prices with a lot more volatility. So the question I have is, well, where are we today? And again, the expectation, right now, our beliefs are we're going to have a really big corn crop, and we're seeing lower prices with less volatility. So the translation is it takes a bigger piece of news to get the corn market really, really excited, either on the upside or on the downside. Okay, so let's say do the same thing with soybeans. The red line over here, red column, excuse me, of numbers, that's what we got on Monday. So this is all new information that USDA provided. The blue column is an update from last month for the old crop. That's the soybeans we have in the bin, and there were some minor adjustments. And then the green is from 2 years ago. Okay, so we are expecting to see a reduction or cut in soybean acres, actually to levels that we saw pretty much back here in 2003. We are looking at a trend line yield. Okay, so that's a bit of an increase. The last couple of years we've had a little bit below average yields across the US. Our total production is going to be actually pretty similar to last year. That was the graphic I showed you earlier. Now, interesting enough, USDA is forecasting a slight increase in crushings. Part of that is because we are seeing more crushing plants come online, especially here in North Dakota. But there's also some crushing plants that are expanding their capacity. Okay. Slight reduction in exports. Okay, not a big change, but we've had a pretty good export season in soybeans actually this year, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But if you drop to the bottom line, because we have an increase in production, or actually stable production, slight decrease increase, excuse me, in total consumption, our bottom line for soybeans are actually expected to drop, which should be a bit more favorable for soybean prices. So when we look at our percentage ending stocks, this is our last trade war back here, just as a reminder. So this 2018-19 and 2020 timeframe, that was our last trade war. Okay, this is where we are today. We're looking at some pretty high levels historically, with the exception of the trade war, the last couple of years, but we're starting to take that down because our planted acreage is dropping. Okay, so what does that mean for prices and price volatility? Well, we are in this lower end of the range. We're seeing what we saw similar back here in those years where we had bigger inventories. But as we go into the summer months, I do expect, at least from a production standpoint, the oilseed market, especially soybeans, to be a little bit more volatile, a little bit more sensitive to yield and yield potential here in the US. Obviously, on the flip side, we're going to be watching the exports and export pace very, very carefully also. And again, just for a reference point, these are the prices that we saw in the futures market during the last trade war as reference. So if things get really ugly on the trade side, we do have downward risks. Okay, prices can go lower from here. I know that's not what you want to hear, but you've got to understand the soybean market is very sensitive to what happens internationally. Switching to wheat, just to continue the thought process, the red is the information we got on Monday. The blue is the current crop or current inventories. And then the green is from 2 years ago. Dropping to the bottom line, it looks as though we're starting to continue to build our ending stocks of wheat. And that's not only spring wheat, but that's also winter wheat. Okay, so we have to look at the wheat complex as a whole complex first before we start saying, well, what about spring wheat specifically? When we look at all wheat inventories, it took us several years, but we were able to finally bring some of our inventories down, a combination of cutting some acres and some pretty good export pace. But the last couple of years, it looks like our inventories have continued to increase, which is going to be a bit tough on the wheat market, specifically winter wheat, but also for spring wheat. So when we look at the spring wheat numbers specifically, this is for spring wheat only, our ending stocks are expected to increase a little bit here going into the 25-26 timeframe. So what does that mean for pricing? We're definitely in this lower part of the pricing range right now today. Is there potential for some price response or some lifts in the market? Yes, there are. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. But the wheat market is going to be under some pressure. And not only here in the United States, but also what's happening globally. I know that last winter I talked about some potential for some production problems in Russia and maybe some production problems in India. Well, over the last several months, actually the last couple of weeks, both of those regions have gotten some rain showers and the crop conditions have improved pretty significantly. So some of those concerns I was worried about, the potential for some higher prices in the wheat market, may not pan out like I was hoping earlier on. So what about how big a role does trade and in particular trade flows impact pricing? When we look at corn, our big uses for corn, the blue line is for feed, which is again primarily going into the livestock sector domestically. The red line is ethanol, again, very important for the energy sector. And then the black line is the exports. And then the green line on the bottom is everything else. Once again, these little dots on the far right-hand side are the current forecast for the crop that we're planting today. So USDA is calling for pretty similar usage and consumption levels to last year with a few small tweaks. The point I'm trying to make here is in the corn market, we've had some pretty good last year in particular, a pretty good export season. And USDA currently is forecasting that to continue. And I think a lot of that is because of what's happening in Mexico. Last year, the Mexican corn area had pretty severe drought. The drought conditions in the majority of Mexico, it continues today. So the expectation is that they're going to have need for additional corn. They don't have to buy from the U.S. They can import from other countries, but we're the closest supplier for them. So yes, even though it's a smaller percentage of total use, the export market still has a big impact on corn prices. What about soybeans? The blue line is domestic crushing. You know that you can see that that's been increasing pretty steadily and consistently over the last probably 10 or 15 years, which is a good thing, right? Domestic crush is a good, stable demand base for our soybeans. The problem, of course, has always been on the export side, and USDA is forecasting a slight decrease in exports, and I do think some of that is the uncertainty because of the trade issues and in particular trade with China. Now, we sell to a lot of other countries, but China is our dominant customer, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. What about wheat? Anybody that grows wheat in this region understands that exports are very, very critical for wheat prices. And one of the challenges we've had the last several years, about the last 5 or 6 years, has been competitiveness in the global wheat market. There's some of our major competitors, in particular the Black Sea, Russia specifically, that have had some very good production. They've been willing and able to sell their wheat at a very, very low price globally. And we've just had a very difficult time competing with them on those for those bushels and for those markets. So we still have a core group of customers. We have a core group of companies and countries that buy from the United States and they prefer U.S. wheat. But we have to be very careful because most of those are also price sensitive. They're very quality sensitive, but of course it's also pricing. So USDA is forecasting pretty stable or very similar export levels to this year, which is an improvement, but still not near the levels we saw over the last several years. The blue line is food use. That's primarily wheat going into the domestic milling market. Again, very, very good and very stable demand base for U.S. wheat, but it's not necessarily a growth market for us. It's a stable market, but not necessarily a growth market. Okay, so who buys U.S. greens? And I did update these as of the information we had last week. This morning, we got updated numbers for our export sales. I did not have time before the session today to be able to update these numbers. So this is really some information from last week, but I do want to give you a general idea of who buys U.S. Ag products, bulk products like corn, soybeans, and wheat. So what I'm doing is I'm taking that export line and I'm separating it out by country. So this is ranked based off of the biggest buyers to the smallest buyers, and we're using last year's totals as that reference point. Okay, so these 4 columns on the left-hand side are 12-month totals. So this is how much we sold during these different marketing years to these different countries. And Mexico, over the last several years, has been our #1 customer. Okay. Now these 2 columns on the far right-hand side are a little bit different. Those are year-to-date sales. So on the far column on the far right side, how much have we sold this year so far from September 1 through the first part of May? Okay. So we still have some months left in our export season before we close out that marketing year. But how are we doing so far this year? And then the column right next to it is the same time period last year. So we have last year's total, we have year-to-date last year, and then year-to-date this year. So let's just look at this just for comparison very quickly. Mexico, our #1 customer, they have actually increased their purchases so far this year for U.S. corn. A lot of that was earlier in the season. It's starting to slow down now because of seasonal, kind of some seasonal patterns. Japan, again, #2 buyer for U.S. corn typically. Again, an increase from this time last year. Last year was a better year for our corn exports. Colombia, actually last year was #3. This year, they've already purchased almost the same amount they did total last year. So that's, again, a growing, I guess, yeah, I would say a growing market for us is in Colombia. I do want to point to China. So last year, China was our #4 customer. I do want to come back to what we saw in 2020 and 21. That was our phase 1 agreement year. So coming out of the trade war, last trade war we had with China, there was the phase 1 agreement where China agreed to buy more U.S. ag products. And they did do that. Didn't quite meet the totals that were in the agreement, but they did buy more. But notice what's happened to our export sales to China since then. And this is the amount we've sold so far this year. And this is the whole marketing year. This was been since before the trade war started. So right now, China is not a big buyer of U.S. corn. They have bought a lot in the past. Okay, so South Korea, a significant increase in their corn purchases, which has been very beneficial. Taiwan, again, a very significant increase in their purchases. So notice we've got Japan, Korea, and Taiwan are all Asian countries, which gives a slight advantage for the PNW, or the exports of corn out of the out of the PNW versus the Gulf of Mexico. Now this ROW is rest of world, so that's everybody else. Okay, so it's all the other countries we sell to that are not on this list. And notice that we've seen a pretty good increase in selling to these other smaller markets, or these other countries that typically don't buy a lot of corn from the US. So the translation is we're so far having a pretty good export season. So far this year, we've sold more, even though we have about 3 months left, we've sold more this year than we did all of last year. And very close to what we saw as a total in 21-22. So good export season for corn. USDA is forecasting that those exports to continue now into this 25 marketing year. So again, that's the expectation. Those are kind of mentally what people are thinking about. So hopefully we'll be able to continue and be able to supply those international markets. But for corn, China may not be a dominant buyer. We'll have to wait to see. Okay, what about soy? What about soybeans? Not a surprise to anybody. China is our #1 customer. They're not quite as buying as aggressively this year as they did last year, but most of their purchases are already completed. So right now with the Brazilian harvest, China's buying almost all their soybeans out of Brazil anyway. So the trade tensions between the United States and China has not really impacted old crop soybeans much. And the reason I want to be very cautious in how I present this, because they have already bought most of their soybeans from the US. If the trade tensions continue with China, it might have a bigger impact on new crop sales because they have not bought any new crop from us yet. So this is something we're gonna have to watch as we move forward. Now, Mexico is our number 2 customer. Again, yes, it's a distant number 2. I get that. It's a big difference between the number 1 buyer of China and the number 2 buyer of Mexico. But these are pretty good sales. They're up a little bit from last year. Indonesia about the same, Japan about the same, Spain about the same, Germany about the same. We've seen an increase in Egypt, the Egyptian buying, which is good. And we've seen a pretty good increase in this ROW, meaning the rest of the world. So even though China has decreased their purchases, we've been able to at least temporarily find some other markets to be able to make up some of that difference. So our total export sales of soybeans are actually pretty good relative to the same time last year. Now, we may not reach those totals we saw a couple of years ago, but they are pretty good. Okay, and I just wanted to show the seasonal pattern. So this is week by week, how much soybean do we sell? These are contracts that have been signed for the purchase of US soybeans. So we see a lot of these big sales going on right at harvest, typically because we have the flow of grain is very high. We have a lot of soybeans hitting the market, but also that also tends to be a pretty good time, lower prices in the international market to be able to buy soybeans. So for old crop soybean sales, I don't think we're going to see a lot of change from now until the end of the marketing year, but we will be watching new crop sales very, very closely. But that won't happen until this October, November timeframe. So we got a little bit of time to wait to figure that out. What about wheat? Now this is all wheat blended together. Just want to show you Mexico is our number 1 customer. They buy more wheat than any other country. Philippines is pretty close, but as a number 2. So Mexican wheat buying is up a little bit. Philippines is down just a tiny bit. Last year, we did sell some wheat to China, but typically we don't sell a lot. So that's not really a common market for us. But if they do come in and buy, they usually buy pretty significant portions. Now, this year, they haven't bought much. We'll have to wait to see what happens in 2025, the crop that's being planted right now, because in northern China, they do have some drought conditions occurring. So their production might be down. Now, China has some really big reserves. They got some big government-owned stocks that they can rely on, but there's some question about the quality of those stocks, okay? Japan, a slight increase. Korea, a pretty nice increase. Taiwan, about the same. Rest of the world, everybody else is increasing a little bit. So we're seeing a much better export season this year, but again, we're coming off some pretty low levels historically. What about spring wheat? Now, this is spring wheat only. Yes, the Philippines is our number 1 customer, and they're off just a little bit this year. Not a lot, but they are down a little bit. Mexico is our number 2 customer. So even for spring wheat, Mexico is a really important market for us. About the same levels. Japan, good steady customer. Same with Taiwan and Korea and Vietnam. And we are seeing some other countries come in, some other countries that typically don't buy a lot of spring wheat for us. We're being price competitive, which is a good thing. We're having some better export season for U.S. spring wheat, but again, much lower than we've seen a few years ago. So what about our export pace? And I want to think about trade and timing. Okay, right now we're in a lot of negotiations. There's a lot of concern about will we have some of these trade issues worked out before we start the next big export season. So we tend to have some very seasonal patterns in our export sales. So this is accumulated exports, which means every time we make a new export sale, we add it to the pile. So what we'd like to see is this pile of exports grow as quickly as possible. So during this time frame, when you see this line increasing, kind of climbing the hill, that means that we continue to sell more and more, in this case, corn. But when we reach this peak, what it means is we're really not adding more to the pile. So our export sales start to slow up. Now, so far for corn, we started out the season very, very well. And you know what? Those export sales have continued. So we're having a good corn season. The question everybody's asking is, when will this start to flatten out and when will it start to kind of tip over? When do we start to see our new export sales drop off? So we do see a window now for old crop corn. We've got about 3 months or so before we start to switch into the new crop season. So we will expect to see corn export sales drop off. That's what we typically see this time of year. The question is that going to come really soon, or are we going to continue to see more sales before that occurs? So the reason this is important, and I'll talk about it in just a minute, is because it's the timing. It's the timing of when this happens. When do we get better trade? If there's going to be some trade deals and some negotiations going on, we need to have that wrapped up before we start to have harvest. So we have a window here where trade negotiations may not have a big impact on price, but very soon that will change. What about soybeans? You can see we have some really strong months where we have very aggressive export sales, and then all of a sudden they start to taper off. This is just a different version of the graphic I showed you before. What about wheat? Now this is all wheat. Wheat is got some of the similar patterns, but the export season lasts a little longer before it starts to kind of flatten out. So the red line is where we are today, and the other colored lines are the other years. You can see that we have pretty stable, steady export sales. And about this time of year, it starts again to flatten out, where our sales pace, the amount of new sales coming into the marketplace, tends to slow pretty significantly, because I think a lot of the buyers are waiting to see what happens to the quantity and the quality of our wheat crop here in the US as we get into harvest. When we look at spring wheat, yes, I did change. This is all wheat. This is spring wheat. They look very similar. The spring wheat sales started out pretty good. I think people were pretty optimistic, but the last several months we started to drop off. The pace, the rate that we get new sales progress has started to slow. So I was really kind of hoping and crossing my fingers that this more aggressive export season would last better and longer for spring wheat, but it hasn't. It's starting to slow up here now a little bit. So let's talk about current negotiations. What's happening right now? I want to give you an update and timing. I'm going to argue that timing is going to be really important. So where are we today? I just want to give a brief update, and I want to be very careful about terminology. So some of the things that are coming out in press releases and you see in the media leaves the impression that we're making really great progress and that we're going to have deals available very quickly. Well, I want to caution everybody that's not typically the case. These trade negotiations to finally get a new agreement takes long time. So on average, it takes about 18 months, about a year and a half of negotiations to get a new trade agreement, a formal one that everybody finally signs on the line and we have a new piece of kind of contracts, okay? Now, the deals that we've seen so far are early in the negotiations. So what has happened is essentially the U.S. Trade Representative's office is talking with their counterparts in these other countries and saying, well, let's agree on what we should negotiate. And that's about all we've gotten so far. So even though there's a deal, what it means is we've come to an agreement on what we're going to negotiate. Okay, so we got to be a little bit careful about interpreting how quickly some of these new agreements may come. Now, this is still significant. The fact that we've agreed to kind of sit down and talk, and we're going to have these negotiations on these really specific items is a very good step forward. And these tit-for-tat trade tariff things that have been going on have started to now back away, which is really good. That's a very good step in progress in the right direction. but it doesn't mean that we're going to have new trade agreements really, really quickly. So let's talk about it. United Kingdom or the UK, this is would be Britain. They have an economic prosperity deal. That was what the White House called it, where we define the terms of negotiation. So we've agreed on what we're going to negotiate on. We made a little bit of progress to getting to some resolution, but it's still going to take a while to develop a formal trade agreement. Japan, we've already had 2 rounds of trade talks. Again, we're negotiating, we're talking, and those negotiations will continue. And to be very honest, agriculture is part of those negotiations, and Japan has some pretty heavy restrictions on the import of specifically like US rice. Okay. But a lot of this has to do with other products like automobiles and steel and aluminum. Okay. Mexico, we still have 25% tariffs on all US non-MCA products from Mexico. So Mexican products coming into the US that aren't covered by USMCA are a 25% tariff. But Mexico has not retaliated. So far, we're still able to send a lot of our US ag products into Mexico, and that still remains a good market for us. Now, we really don't know what kind of discussions are going on behind the scenes because there hasn't been any public notice. What about Canada? Canada is also a really important trading partner. 25% tariffs. The US has put 25% tariffs on Canadian products and about 10% tariff on crude oil. So now I want to emphasize these are products we're buying from Canada that are non-USMCA. Okay. So this is Canadian products coming into the US. Now, steel and aluminum and automobiles have their own special category. So we do have some tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, as well as Canadian oil and some of their automobile products. Okay, but Canada has retaliated on selected items. They have a kind of a short list of things of US products going into Canada, and some of those do include agricultural products, including wheat and barley and pulse crops and canola. Now, rumor has it that discussions are going on with the Canadians, but again, there hasn't been a lot of public notice and public releases to that. Vietnam, talks have begun, but again, we don't know where we stand. So again, we do have some trade agreements directly with Vietnam, but we need to renegotiate some of those contract terms. India, you've probably heard a lot of talk about India, and what they really have done is establish the terms of reference. Again, these are like pre-negotiations. The Indian government and the US government have agreed on what we're going to talk about. These are the core items that we're going to focus on for negotiations to try and come up with a new trade agreement. Okay, so the talks are continuing. China, let's talk specifically about China. A lot of stuff in the news about China. It's going to continue to be one of those things that impacts grains and our economy very quickly and very directly. So we have mutually agreed that we're going to reduce tariffs for 90 days. So for the products the US buys from China, it was at 145%. For the next 90 days, that's been dropped to 30%. China had put on 125% tariffs on US products going into China, like US corn, soybeans, and wheat. Those products now, those tariffs have been dropped to 10%. So even though 10% is higher than zero, right? But it's a lot less than 125. So if we can get the pricing right, and China does need US ag products, it is possible for US ag products to flow into China under today's rules. I do want to talk about this just briefly. De minimis tariffs, meaning there is a special tariff on very small purchases. So if the purchase is less than $600 and it's to an individual, there was actually no tariffs for a long time. That did go to, so again, if you're a US consumer buying directly from a Chinese company, and it comes in a small package, essentially, that was not tariffed, but that went to 120%. That's now been dropped back down to 54%. So translation to that is If you're ordering things on Amazon directly from a Chinese company, those things are going to be tariffed at a much higher rate. Now, some Chinese non-tariff barriers, and China does use some other things besides direct tariffs to try and restrict the flow of products like U.S. ag products into China. Some of those trade barriers have been removed. Now, there's not a lot of details behind this. A lot of the negotiations so far has been very, very quiet behind closed doors. There's not a public information about it, but that's a step in the right direction. Okay. And then finally, the status of negotiations are unknown. I know there's talks going on. I know there's a lot of pressure being put on both the U.S. as well as Chinese trade negotiators to come up with some kind of deal as soon as possible. I'm not expecting anything to happen really quickly because, as I said, the phase one agreement, it took us 18 months to negotiate the phase one agreement, and that was under a lot of pressure from both the U.S. and Chinese governments. So to get a final deal, to get some kind of formal agreement is going to take a while. The fact that we're not beating each other up, that we've dropped this tit for tat strategy where I increase my tariffs and you increase your tariffs, the fact that we've backed away from that is still very, very good news for trade. We also, just to remind everybody, we have negotiations going on with a lot of other countries. Now, this is the list of countries that I found. I might be missing something. A couple that I'm paying attention to, of course, is Australia, but also South Korea, Colombia, okay, as well as Dominican Republic and Peru. Now, so we sell some dry edible beans into Dominican Republic. That's why I'm mentioning those. So there are other negotiations going on. They don't make the news as quickly and easily as some of the really big ones, like with the UK and with China. So where are we sitting today with the futures market? I pulled these charts last night at about 10 o'clock. I know I'm getting very close to my time. We continue to see a lot of volatility. This is December corn, so this would be a harvest price for corn. We saw a really nice rally until we got into this trade negotiations and all the tariff things that happened. And so we are seeing a lot of volatility. I do expect that to continue, especially for new crop corn. Moving to new crop soybeans, our total price levels have dropped, and we do see a lot of volatility. And as you can see, we get the soybean prices are very responsive to trade and trade negotiations. Not a surprise to anybody. So we're just going to have to be very patient. You're going to have to be very careful about pricing and trying to be ahead of the game when it comes to pricing both corn, soybeans. For wheat has really struggled, especially spring wheat. More recently, we've had very quick planting progress. The winter wheat crop looks like it's currently in pretty good condition. There's been some improvement in the Russian wheat crop condition ratings. It looks as though some of the problems we saw in Europe European wheat has also been starting to straighten out from a weather standpoint. So just psychologically, this has put some pressure in the wheat market. And I'm not as pessimistic as some on wheat. I do think there is still some opportunities for wheat, but we're going to have a little bit more time and to be able for those things to play out. And I do want to comment just very quickly about canola because we've had a really nice response recently in canola prices, and I know some farmers in the northeast corner of the state that are really excited about that. We are seeing some retracement in canola prices this morning. Again, that's more about some changes in U.S. biofuels policy than anything really with supply and demand conditions in canola. But we've had a really good spike in canola. Hopefully, farmers have been able to do some pricing. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'll stop sharing. We'll open things up for any kind of questions that might be coming up.
Well, thanks, Frayne. Well, we did have one question come in. So I just want to mention everybody, I did unmute everybody. You're still probably muted on your line, but if you prefer to actually directly ask Frayne a question, you can unmute yourself and ask him. But I will start with one question that we had come in through chat. So year-to-date commitments for the 2023-24 hard red spring wheat were actually higher than the full year sale. Did we have significant amounts of canceled sales? Is the first part of that question.
Okay. So actually, very sharp eyes. That was a very good note that you made. So what happens is those are sales commitments. Okay. So what happens is, a buyer and a seller would say, okay, I'm going to agree to sell U.S. spring wheat to a company in Japan. Okay, we sign that agreement. As soon as we sign that agreement, it gets reported in those tables that I showed you. Now, there's two things that can happen. Number one is, yes, there could be a cancellation, and that is allowed in international trade with some fees. There's cancellation fees, but it is allowed, and those fees get to be pretty substantial. So once in a while it happens, but it's not as common in wheat as it is in, let's say, soybeans. The other possibility is that the buyer said, well, I want to buy it today and price it, but I don't want it delivered until sometime in the future. Okay, and we're getting now close enough to the end of the marketing year where sometimes that delivery time is shifted from delivery in this marketing year into the next marketing year. So basically, it's just a transfer from this marketing year, which starts on June 1, into the next marketing year. So some of that's just an accounting process where instead of being put in this accounting year, it's put in the next accounting year. So that's the more likely explanation, is that last year some of that was shifted.
So then to kind of add on to that, is that something I guess a producer has to worry about going forward as well happening?
So I typically, in both those cases, whether it be a cancellation or whether it be just a shift in the timing, they typically don't have major implications or major impacts on prices. So it's something I pay attention to. I'm just trying to figure out what's happening and why it's happening. But it's not something that really causes big price movements. So it's not something that you as a farm manager need to really worry about that much. If I'm a trader, right? If I'm a local elevator or if I'm one of the big grain merchandisers, that's something I pay attention to. But as a farm manager, that's not something you really have to worry about.
All right. Frayne, another one. Do you see the outcome of this tariff war to be as impactful on U.S. ag markets as we've seen during the first tariff war? I guess the good and the bad.
The good and the bad. That's a really complicated question. So let me try and answer it this way. I want to separate into short-term issues and then the longer-term issues. So short-term issues gets to be really complicated. And in my mind, it really does depend upon, number one, timing, and number two, how quickly we can back away from this very aggressive tariff stance. So if we can move away from this really aggressive tit for tat strategy we're using right now in the US, if we can back away and say, okay, we've made our point, let's sit down and negotiate, let's start working through our problems. If we can get to that stage where people calm down a little bit, I think that there won't be long-term damage. I think that prices and export sales can recover, and we could get back to more of a normal trade. So I don't know that it's going to be necessarily a big boom, but I don't know that it'll be a major bust. Because to make changes in the flow of grain, we're going to have the trade agreements signed. So just the fact that we're backing away from tariffs doesn't mean that the rules for buying and selling have changed. Okay. Now, longer term, that gets to be a lot more complicated. And I am really concerned about the long-term impacts for this. So historically, we in the United States have been able to say, well, we're a really reliable supplier. Not only can we provide you what kind of quantity and quality you want, we'll deliver it on time. Our delivery system, our transportation and logistics system is very, very strong. Okay, and we have a very stable political environment in the United States relative to a lot of other countries, like in particular Brazil or in Argentina, that have a lot more political disruption and economic disruption than we do here in the United States. So we've always been able to lean on that and say, well, yeah, we're a little bit higher priced, but we're a very stable, reliable supplier. If you do business with us, you know what to expect. Well, now politically today, that has changed. And I think there's going to be buyers, especially some countries, they're going to look at the US and saying, well, how politically stable is that? Are we going to, we as our country, are we going to somehow get picked on? And so that changes the dynamics. This is all about relative. How does the US stack up against other countries that they can buy from? And I am really concerned about this political instability making people a little bit more nervous to do a lot of business in the United States. Okay, we're still very reliable in our transportation system, our ability to deliver the right kind of product at the right time. And of course, companies do business with companies. But this political instability does cause kind of some worry in the back of some traders' minds, especially in particular countries. They say, well, maybe there isn't as big a difference between buying corn from the United States versus buying corn from Brazil, or buying wheat from the United States versus buying wheat from Argentina. So I am concerned about the longer term implications.
Thank you. Another question for canola. If tariffs are maintained between the US and Canada, would this likely have a more positive or negative effect on the demand for North Dakota canola?
Um, that's a really complicated, because there's it's a complicated thing, because there's a lot of product flowing back and forth over the line, because we have some US canola going into Canada to be crushed. We have some Canadian canola coming into the US to be crushed. The net effect, I think, would be negative. And here's why I say that. Because the profitability for growing and crushing canola is to provide the oil. Okay. And in Canada, the biggest buyer of canola, whole canola, is actually, from an export standpoint, is China. Okay. And China is also a very significant buyer of Canadian canola meal, but also canola oil. However, the United States is the #1 buyer of Canadian canola oil. So if all of a sudden Canada has a hard time selling canola oil into the US market for human consumption or for renewable fuels, that makes the profitability of crushing canola drop. And so prices for canola will decrease. And given the trade tensions between Canada and China, I don't know that Canada can push that extra canola oil or whole seed canola into the Chinese market to compensate. So even though you say, well, boy, if there's this tariff, is it going to influence, are we going to have less canola coming into the US to be crushed? Possibly. But I think the net effect on the canola market as a whole would be negative, simply because prices for canola oil would drop, the crushing margins, the profitability for crushing canola would drop, which then would put some downward pressure on canola prices, both in the US and in Canada.
Well, thanks, Frayne. I think that looks like all the questions, but I did want to put a plug in for NDSU Extension. So the egg market economists, once a month, is it every third or second Thursday? They do
It
an egg market solutions and outlooks for all commodities, so livestock, ethanol, fuels, crop markets. So I just want to put a plug into that I put the chat in, the direct link to that. If you haven't watched that, it's really good to take part in that too. And I know those are recorded, but Frayne, are those the second or the third? I can't remember.
It's usually the Thursday after the WASDE report.
Okay,
So
after the
it's
WASNI
typically
report.
right. So it's typically usually it's the second Thursday of the month. And as you said, this is where I come on for a few minutes, and we talk about the livestock sector. Tim Petrie comes in. We talk about the farm program and farm policy issues. We talk about the general economy. This is kind of a broader based overview of all of things impacting agriculture. So this was very focused on grain and grain marketing. And obviously I speak at that, but I have all of my coworkers also chime in and they give their perspective on what's happening. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, well, thank you for presenting today. I really appreciate it. Again, this is being recorded, so I'll send everybody Frane's presentation and a direct link to the recording if you want to rewatch it or share it. Also, join us next month, again, the third Thursday at 10 a.m. We'll be having our North Dakota legislative specialists kind of give an update of what happened and didn't happen for the legislative year that really impacts a lot of our rural communities and agriculture in particular. So, thank you again, everybody, and I hope you have a good day. See you later. Bye.